Great. Okay. So you've studied over the years documents from where, the FBI, Dallas Police, or just the...
Well, both FBI, Dallas Police, Secret Service, any agency that generated documents related to the case, and particularly to Lee Harvey Oswald, which happens to be the specialty of my research, one of the specialties.
Right. And you have documents pertaining to his traveling to his supposed defection to the Soviet Union. Correct?
Not so much there. I touch on that, but I've specialized more in documents related to his travels in Mexico, for one thing.
Okay.
And I can speak of those when we're ready.
Okay. Yeah, whenever you're ready.
All right. Of course, the official story was that Oswald, in late September of '63, went to Mexico, supposedly seeking to return to the Soviet Union by way of Cuba, which was obviously friendly to the Soviet Union at that point. And that he was there 4 or 5 days, visited both the Cuban consulate and the Soviet embassy, and his quest for entry visas and documents to return to the Soviet Union failed to get those documents and returned to Dallas. In the course of that visit to Mexico, he supposedly, at least after the assassination, the stories came out that he made several provocative visits to communist and Castro officials in Mexico, and after the assassination, those supposed visits were used to try to create an image of the assassination not just as an Oswald activity, but as one backed by Castro and or the Soviet Union. So it's extremely important to the case exactly what Oswald did in Mexico, and the thrust of my research is that he very likely did not do anything in Mexico, because he very likely never even made the trip in question. I have an article in an older 1985 article called "The Trip That Never Was, Oswald in Mexico." And in that article, as in much of my research, at least in the late 80s research I was doing, I focused on the documentary record of Oswald's visit to Mexico, his travels, his crossing of the border, and the immigration records that were created in the crossing both to and from Mexico, the records of his traveling by the buses that he supposedly traveled to and from in Mexico, and his registration at the Hotel del Comercio in downtown Mexico City. And all of these records are severely suspicious, to the point that the FBI, by around March of 1964, was so unhappy with the results of investigation that they sent what they called a special squad of 3 investigators to Mexico to try to straighten out the record of Oswald's movements in Mexico. Spent about 3 months there, threw up their hands, and said, in effect, the Mexican government, which had custody of these records, has played so many games with us, and there's so many suspicions of documentary forgery on the part of the Mexican government. Basically, we give up. We can't figure it out. So that was the atmosphere in which these kinds of documents were generated. Now, one I would like to talk about. I think there are a lot of documents that are suspicious of forgery. There are some documents, and if we have time, I'll speak of 3 or 4 documents that I think are kind of smoking gun, prima facie proof of forgery, and in some significant areas. But the one related to Mexico City that I would speak about is the registry of Oswald's name in room 18 of the Hotel del Comercio. The peculiarity of this document, if you look at it, is that in room 18, supposedly occupied by Oswald, there is the name Lee, Harvey Oswald, and this is in the handwriting that is otherwise authenticated as that of Lee Harvey Oswald. The problem, and it's almost too obvious to the naked eye, in looking at this hotel registry for September 27th, 1963, is that all the other names on that list are in the same handwriting, unknown other handwriting, and Oswald's name alone is there in his handwriting, as if either Oswald himself or someone else on his, quote, behalf wrote his name in his handwriting, no less. Now, that peculiarity, someone, probably about the time the special squad was headed for Mexico in March of '64, someone finally noticed this anomaly and asked the hotel manager about it. And the hotel manager's explanation was that on the first night that a guest arrives at that hotel, he signs the hotel registry in his own name. And if the guest stays over any subsequent nights, the hotel clerk copies all the names of people that are staying over. So it would seem from that account that only Lee Harvey Oswald arrived, or Lee, Harvey Oswald, which is the way his name was written on his 15-day entry visa, that only Lee Harvey Oswald arrived at that hotel on the 27th. But the FBI itself investigated as many of these fellow guests at the hotel as they could, and they found out that I believe it was 8 other people also arrived on the 27th. So on their own account, their names should have been in their own handwriting. And the other problem with that is that even on that account, the registry for September 28th again has a unique handwriting for Oswald. Everyone else's handwriting is still in the handwriting of some unknown person, probably a hotel clerk. But the name Oswald in room 18 is unique handwriting, or in this case printing. The name has changed. It is now Lee Harvey as opposed to Lee, Harvey Oswald. It is now Lee Harvey. It is in another handwriting, and it is not the handwriting that is true of all the other names on the list. And the same is true, the same Lee Harvey, the following 2 nights. The same situation. To me, there is no doubt that there is something drastically amiss about this record of Oswald being at the Hotel Del Comercio, and the likelihood that the name was written in at some point after the FBI got the document from the Mexican government by way of the hotel, that either the FBI or the Mexican government furnished the name for purposes of proving that Oswald was there in Mexico at that time, particularly with the lack of other documentary proof. Again, the immigration records, the bus records, everything is wrong document-wise about Oswald's movements in Mexico.
Good. Good. Very good. That's good. Okay, what else?
All right. Another area of specialty, or I guess the direction of research. Yeah.
You dropped your, popped out again.
Popped out.
While you're doing that, let me just go back and just check. Okay.
I think the basic problem for the investigative agencies that wanted to prove that Oswald was the assassin was it was necessary to create a set of documents that would prove his possession of the rifle, prove that the fingerprints that were found at the scene of the crime, that is on the 6th floor of the school book depository, a palm print on the rifle, that these prints were those of Lee Harvey Oswald. And starting with a hypothetical, in which I did not start with, but it sort of arrived at this conclusion, or at least tentative conclusion, that Oswald may have been something of a paper individual. He was created on paper for purposes of establishing an assassin, a person who, in a name other than his own, A. Hidell or A.J. Hidell, had ordered a rifle, the rifle used to kill the president, had ordered a pistol, the pistol used to kill Officer J.D. Tippit, and that there would be a record of his orders. There would be a record of the post office box to which at least the rifle was sent, and there again there would be a useful an evidence establishing record of his fingerprints that could be compared against the incriminating fingerprints supposedly found at the scene. Establishing Oswald's identity using his signature or any of the normal documents that a person has turned out to be very, very tricky. His fingerprint cards that I'll speak about in a minute. But I just first, I guess, would like to speak of another document that is, again, kind of prima facie evidence that documents were somehow created dealing with Lee Oswald. In 1959, as Oswald was about to leave the Marine Corps, or about to be transferred out, he got a hardship discharge from the Marines in '59. Before he left the Marines in September of 1959, he applied for and received a passport. Many people have commented on, wasn't it strange that while he was in the Marines still, he applied for a passport to go overseas, and his supposed reason for the hardship discharge was that his mother had been injured and unable to work, and he was needed at home in her support. But be that as it may, the thing I want to point out here is something about the nature of this application, his application for a passport. And again, I think it represents pretty smoking gun evidence of forgery. This application for a passport was done at Santa Ana, California, where Oswald was last stationed in the Marines, and it was dated the 4th of September, 1959, and is signed Lee H. Oswald. On the lower left-hand area of the passport application, there is a notation saying that an ID card was submitted for proof of who he was, and there's a number for the ID card. This was submitted as proof of his identity when he applied for the passport. From his service records, they make a notation in a personnel record for every personnel transaction of a person. And his service records show that on the 11th of September, 1 week after he applied for the passport, he was relieved from active duty to return to inactive status, which is the way they did it when people completed their active duty. He was relieved from active duty on the 11th of September and was issued this ID card with the same number that he had submitted a week earlier in support of his passport application. So you get the anomaly of Oswald having supposedly submitted a card, an ID card, that he wouldn't receive even for another week. And there are other things about this passport application that suggest that it is not authentic. It was probably not filled out by Lee Oswald. But that seems to represent that one little notation about the submission of a card that had not yet even been issued.
Sir, if you could
Yeah.
just restate that.
Okay.
I'm sure I understand what,
Okay.
what you meant by that. A card, this card is what?
This card is, no, it was found in his effects. It was an ID card with his picture. By the way, a picture that had not yet been taken. According to the Warren Report, which published this picture of Oswald, it was taken in the Soviet Union, which was after he was out and had defected to the Soviet Union. So it has a picture on it that had not yet been taken. This is the same ID number. It was submitted in support of his passport application a week before it was given to him. I think my first one of my first articles I ever published on the Kennedy assassination was called "The Twilight Zone ID Card in a Time Machine." It's kind of like this one goes back and forth in time. If you talk about anachronisms, this is the last word in anachronisms are time anomalies. And it's the picture is too late and and this is too early.
Interesting.
I wanted to speak about a couple of. I published an article in the third decade, which is what the fourth decade was before 1993. I published an article called "These Are a Few of My Favorite Forgeries," and the passport application was one of my favorites. This is another favorite. Both the passport application and the documents I'm going to talk about now were used to authenticate Oswald's signatures on other documents. These were the, quote, standards that they used of his handwriting. These are supposedly authentic Oswald handwritings. And the point of these documents is to show that these supposedly authentic writings that were used to authenticate other writings may themselves be severely questionable. But here's an example. They used his paychecks and his endorsements on the backs of his paychecks at his job in Jaggers Child Stovall photographic firm in downtown Dallas in spring of '63. They used his endorsements on the back as standards of what his handwriting looked like. For one example, the only one I'm going to mention, one of these checks is issued to Oswald. His endorsement is on the back, and then underneath that is a stamped endorsement of the place where he supposedly cashed a number of his checks, which was the Mart liquor store in the immediate vicinity of the place where he worked. I don't know many liquor stores that would cash a check for somebody that didn't have an account there, but be that as it may. But this particular check that I'm referring to now, number 4992, is there's a document from the FBI in which all of these paychecks were shown to different people that might have their stamped endorsements on the backs of the checks. And Mr. Max Factor, no less, of the Mart liquor store, was shown these various paychecks, and he said, yes, we cashed this one, we cashed that one, and then there were two checks that he said we did not cash those checks. One of them is 4922. Another one is 5511, and I have both of these in the article. And even though he said that we didn't cash those checks, their endorsement stamps on the backs of the checks, which led me to believe that could only believe that Mr. Max Factor, when he was shown checks, was shown other checks than those that finally found their way into the record. And those are just a couple of the really huge number of instances of a discrepancy between the way these documents appear and the way people said that they appeared, making one believe that there's something really questionable about these standards.
So what does that tell you then? What can you conclude?
What I conclude is that somehow, and this is hard to envision the scenario of how it was done, but given the range of anomalies in the Oswald documentation, it would seem that after the assassination there was a massive effort to gather every single piece of paper with Oswald's handwriting or signatures, and then substituting for key documents whatever was needed to make the case against Oswald. One of the things you learn as you research in this area was the intense and unbelievable speed and thoroughness with which the FBI accumulated every possible piece of evidence, particularly documentary evidence, regarding Oswald. Let me just mention one that I published very recently. I called it The Fed Spring into Action. It was in the fourth decade, a couple of years ago. And one thing that struck me was a Secret Service document, actually, that I think it was at 11 p.m. on February 22nd, 1963, the Secret Service, the local agent in Dallas for the Secret Service, called headquarters and said, we need a copy of Oswald's 1962 income tax return. And they literally sprung into action overnight and went to the record holdings in suburb of Philadelphia, Mechanicsburg, where these records were held, or out of Harrisburg, I should say. The Harrisburg office went to the holdings, and by, I think, 2 a.m. they had retrieved Oswald's 1962 income tax return. Well, what's strange about that? What's strange about that is that there was no real basis for firm conclusion that Oswald was the assassin. And that is just a tip of dozens and dozens of actions of the FBI, Secret Service, the State Department. It seemed that there was immediate and exclusive concern with getting every possible bit of information about Lee Harvey Oswald and ignoring anything else. You know, talk about closing the case and rush to judgment and and all those terms. That was done so quickly, and there was such an intense effort to retrieve every scrap of information relating to Oswald that I, given these and many, many other indications of forgery, I have to believe that there was an operation to retrieve this material and to make whatever changes were necessary to make the case against Oswald the assassin.
Good. About anything else? Other?
Okay, we could of course go on. Oh yeah, I want to speak of the fingerprint cards. Well, again, one of the first things I ever researched. Need a tape. One of the first things that I ever researched on the Kennedy assassination, and this goes back to, I think 1983, I think my first visit to the National Archives on the case. I'm just kind of rummaging and browsing through documents that the archivist brought me, bundles of documents, and I came across something really strange, which was a group of fingerprint cards for Oswald, 3 of them, in a Secret Service report that had never been published anywhere. And there were 3 different versions of the same, they had the same fingerprints, but the way they were filled out was they were filled out in 3 different ways. The only thing that was common to them was that on the side of the card where the person who's being fingerprinted is expected to sign, there was a notation refused to sign. And there was in fact one version of a fingerprint card for Oswald that was dated November 25th, 63, set of fingerprints, and the notation refused to sign. Well, Oswald was murdered on November 24th, 63. So I guess you can't blame him too much if he refused to sign a fingerprint card made for himself the following day. I mean, the implication and what was finally, again, it took forever for anybody to ask this kind of question, but finally the Warren Commission asked the FBI's fingerprint expert why Oswald was photographed on November 25th. His corpse, obviously, was fingerprinted. And Sebastian Latona was his name. Mr. Latona replied, "Sir, I think the purpose of making those fingerprints was for the Dallas police to officially inform us that Mr. Oswald was dead." Like, anybody in the country that saw Oswald being shot the morning before could have verified that for the FBI if necessary. But anyway, they went and they took fingerprints of the corpse in order to inform them. I wrote an article on this. I call it Sebastian Latona, Where Are You When We Need You? Because there were many inconsistencies about the fingerprint cards. One that I found, and it was really doing some very local research right here in Fredonia. I asked the local homicide officer. We have one in our police department, or did before he retired. We don't have homicides here, so he didn't really have much work to do. But in any case, I asked the homicide person to look at the card, and I covered up Oswald's identity on it so he wouldn't know what he was looking at. And I said, "What about these prints? These refused to sign prints?" And my friend, the homicide detective, said, "Those are not the prints of a dead person." Because when you fingerprint a dead person, it's not like a live person. You have to roll the fingers to print. You either get your person to cooperate with rolling, or you take and roll them. But once the person is dead, their fingers go into rigor mortis, and you have something that won't roll on a normal fingerprint card. So if you don't roll them, you have a very different appearing fingerprint card. Now this sounds ghoulish, but he's told me that one thing they sometimes do if they need to identify a body and they have some fingers on it, they'll cut them off and roll them. Or more commonly, they have little strips of paper that they can ink and put the paper around the finger and then paste these pieces of paper on a regular fingerprint card with blanks. But that creates a very different kind of appearance. Now we know Oswald's hands were not severed. At least the body they dug up in 1981 did not have any severed fingers to it. And we know from the appearance of the card that these little cups weren't used. So that this seems to be one of many indications that this fingerprint card was created under other circumstances than what we've been told. Now I have an hypothesis on this. Might or might not be right. But of course, one of the problems of evidence that Oswald was at the scene and had the assassination weaponry in his possession was that the FBI finally found a palm print on the rifle. It wasn't discovered immediately. A Dallas policeman supposedly, quote, lifted the print before he sent the rifle off to Washington on the night of the 22nd, 23rd. But when the rifle got to Washington, the FBI couldn't find any prints on it, and he didn't send his lift along, and his lift only arrived on the 29th of of November in FBI headquarters. So there was a lot of question of how that print got on the rifle, or maybe it was the first guess was that somebody had taken a fingerprint from one of his cards or a palm print. There's a palm on some fingerprint cards. Had taken a palm print and put it on the rifle, but when you do that, you're not going to get the imprint of the irregularities of the rifle on the print, so that doesn't hold up. It would appear that it was possible, and there's some evidence that this happened, that somebody went into the morgue with a rifle or a piece of a rifle, and put fingerprint material on the corpse and impressed that on the rifle, and voila, you have a palm print on the rifle. And there was and this is getting back to the fingerprint card. My hypothesis about this would be that something like this was done, but in order to cover their tracks. I mean, the mortician said that after these people left, they had fingerprint material all over his hands. He had a big problem cleaning up his hands. That perhaps the real purpose of the mission was to get the palm print on the rifle, and in order to cover their tracks for this kind of operation, they had to cover both hands and make one of these refuse to sign fingerprint cards to cover the operation. That's right now the best hypothesis I can think of for this really, really strange creation of or they actually didn't create a fingerprint card. This was fabricated elsewhere. I mean, it gets to be a convoluted plot, but give me a simple explanation and I'll take it.
When was that palm print lifted?
Supposedly on the night, somewhere between 9 and 10 p.m. on the 22nd of November by Lieutenant J.C. Day of the Identification Department of the Dallas Police.
This was after the FBI had checked it and found nothing?
No, the FBI did not have possession of the rifle until shortly after midnight. Vince Drain from the FBI took possession of the rifle and other assassination evidence, took it to Washington. They processed it over the weekend, and then I believe Monday, it could have been Tuesday, but Monday or Tuesday they returned most of the physical evidence to the Dallas Police Department. So it was during this Saturday, Sunday, perhaps Monday period that the FBI lab was examining the rifle and finding no evidence of any kind of fingerprints or palm prints on the rifle.
So the Dallas police claim that they lifted a palm print off the weapon.
Yes.
Then how is that possible? If lifting a palm print, does that mean the palm print then disappeared?
No, it does not mean that. Okay. It means that they got a copy. And in fact, Lieutenant Day said he was so confident that the print was still there that he didn't even bother to inform Agent Drain that he had found a palm print. And it was protected. It was on the it was under the stock. He had to disassemble the stock from the barrel in order to find this palm print. And he reassembled it, and he was so confident that it would be undisturbed that he didn't even tell anybody until voila, the next week Oswald was dead. Oh, by the way, here's the palm print we lifted.
So you would conclude then that their claim on that Friday that they had lifted a palm print, that was just made up, and then it was the following week that they were able to, produce it?
Yeah, from the corpse.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Good. Okay. Did you have any other important documents?
This document is that I want to speak about is Another basic Oswald identity document, it's his application for employment at the Texas School Book Depository. And there are many discrepancies about his employment there, to the point that one can doubt that Oswald was, if you doubt that he was in Mexico ever, you might doubt that he was ever in the Texas School Book Depository, but that a paper Oswald was placed there, because that's obviously where the shot supposedly came from, and you need a TSBD employee. Again, I'm not going to go into the many irregularities on his Texas School Book Depository employment, but just to note that for some reason a detective of the Dallas Police Department, V.T. Bryan, B-R-I-A-N, handwrote an application for Oswald. I have side by side on the back cover of one of the Third Decades the official Oswald application for employment with his official signature, and his official signature is there are several different styles of official signatures, but this matches a number of others. So there's his supposedly authentic application for employment, and next to it is the hand-printed version of that application, signed Lee H. Oswald, but it's not the Oswald signature, and it says by Bryan, Lee H. Oswald by Bryan. So Detective Bryan, for reasons that maybe can only be imagined, well, as I say in my little article accompanying this material, what this proves at least was that the Dallas Police Department had access to blank application forms for the Texas School Book Depository, because this blank was filled out by a police agent, so that they had the facilities to play with this application, perhaps to fabricate it. Why this happened? There must have been duplicating facilities if they needed a record. This document, by the way, this by Bryan, came from obscure sources in the archives, stuff that's never been printed. Again, it was something just found. Actually, I believe, well, I can tell by the file number that this actually came out of the Dallas police files that were only opened relatively recently. But again, this material was not generally available, and it may be, again, this is real speculation, but it may be that this document is an indication of something of the way the forgery operation proceeded, because as a provisional hypothesis, I would suggest that this information was filled out to provide the information that was wanted to prove Oswald's employment, and this was copied over. This was actually copied from the I know this and this, your camera doesn't show, but that the supposed original was actually copied from a supposed copy that perhaps floating around in obscure places. There are other documents that are in other people's handwriting that were the working drafts that were used by the forger to create the, quote, Oswald documents. And I have several other examples of that, but this suffices as a possible example. It's certainly an anomaly again.
What do you think they were trying to accomplish?
I think they were trying to accomplish, as I said at the start, that they were trying to prove that there was a man named Lee Harvey Oswald working at the scene of the crime, and they were trying to prove that he had ordered a mail-order rifle from Klein's in Chicago to a mail-order box in Dallas that was maintained in his name and in the name of Heidel, strangely enough. The idea was to create a person, to literally create the existence of a person, and then to furnish evidence that that paper person committed the crime through the fingerprints, through I'm not going to go into all of the physical evidence that was where, if you look at chain of custody issues, that there's literally nothing, and I would stand by this, there's literally no piece of physical evidence, shells at the scene, the rifle, nothing in the way of physical evidence where there is not severe question that somewhere between the time that it was picked up and the time that it came to court, if you will, came to the Warren Commission, if you will, that there's the possibility of alteration of that material, from the Zapruder film right through. So I would see this as part of the broader operation of fabrication of evidence that probably embraced the autopsy material, the Zapruder film, the so-called backyard photograph, everything that tends to prove Oswald as the lone assassin. It's a big operation, and one might say it's not credible that anything that big could have been done. It would have had to have involved so many people, but them seems to be the facts, man.
Let's talk about the Zapruder film. Initially, what is your opinion of the Zapruder film? People call it,
okay.
It was an accident that, the conspirators, they didn't know that this man was taking this, evidence.
Yeah. Well, what I'll say will be opinion, because it's not, I've published other people that are experts on, including Harry Livingston, and people that take the opposite point of view to Harry Livingston, that indeed the Zapruder film is authentic. But your question was a little different, wasn't it? It was whether the conspirators whether the Zapruder film was part of the conspiracy?
How would you, what do you view I interviewed Darrell Weatherly. He talked about how the Zapruder film really, it serves a purpose to distract people away from the real issues as far as who was involved, who benefited, what was the effect of the assassination into, what bullet came from what direction.
I'm familiar with Darrell's perspective there, and I respect it, and I think that it's a possibility that the whole Zapruder controversy is a distraction. But it's also credible to me that, the official version that he simply happened to be there and happened to be filming, but that what he filmed is not what has become part of the record of the crime. I tend to think in that direction, that Harry Livingston does think, for example. I don't know whether Harry would have, in your interview, whether he dealt with the evidence that the Zapruder film was, not just the kind of work that he's doing now in the archives, showing that the markings on the film are not what they should be, the sort of chain of custody kinds of issues with the film, which are very important matters. But the fact that there was opportunity, not to mention motive, apparently there was opportunity to have altered the Zapruder film in certain ways. The night of the assassination, or the weekend of the assassination, the possession of the Zapruder film is very much in a point of controversy, a point of suspicion. In the very first issue of the Third Decade that I published, there was an article by Phil Melanson, really a kind of a classic analysis of a hidden journey. Apparently, the CIA's photographic interpretation lab in Washington had access to the film, and when it was returned after that hidden journey to Dallas, apparently it was not, or possibly it was not in the same shape that it went to that laboratory. And this was a very hidden, surreptitious journey, literally, that they tried to cover the tracks on, but they left behind some evidence that it did occur. So I do believe the Zapruder film was tampered with. For what purpose, exactly when, and how, that's, I'm not sure.
No. Okay.
What's the audience of this? What's the audience of this?
For this film?
Mm-hmm.
Well, don't know yet. You mean on that as you mentioned as a sociologist, the cover-up. Why the cover-up? It's a good question.
Yeah.
If you could address that.
Okay. A lot of the prevailing public sentiment now seems to be to raise a question about why continue on this kind of research and activity like 30 years and more after the event. There's kind of a strange situation that, according to every public opinion poll I've seen, that the great majority of the American people believe that there was some kind of conspiracy involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. And yet, it seems that there is very little public support for a reinvestigation of the case, for any kind of books or other material that indicate the existence of conspiracy. It's like a public attitude that, yes, something happened there. We don't have the whole story. But, like, I would call it the so what attitude that seems to prevail in the public. And I would think that there are several sources for this attitude. One, I think, is that, as with many situations that we recognize as unfortunate or too bad kinds of situations, shrug of the shoulders, what can you do about it? You can't bring back somebody that's already dead, etc., etc. So there's that human tendency, I think, to think that nothing really effective can be done, so basically why try? But I think this attitude is fed by, one might say, comfort is given for people to be able to maintain this so what attitude by the performance of the media with reference to the assassination. Our media have been remarkably behind even public opinion with reference to conspiracy. The kinds of fawning over fallacious, spurious kinds of books like Gerald Posner's Case Closed. I mean, the way Posner is welcomed on any network, on any talk show, any special having to do with the assassination, there one is liable to find Gerald Posner espousing the same misinformational pieces that run throughout his book. That's the kind of material that the media jumps on. It jumped a few years ago in an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association came out with the astounding information that the autopsy doctors at the Dr. Hume and Boswell, who conducted the president's autopsy, had in an interview had announced that their original autopsy findings were correct. Sound the trumpets. And when people like Harry Livingston and others attempted to challenge the validity of this piece of cover-up, the media wanted nothing to do with it. Accounting for that kind of attitude on the part of the media is not so easy, but I suspect that behind that there's the same need that private people as individuals have to justify their own inaction in the face of previous information. That I should have done something about that long ago. I didn't do it, and apparently there's nothing, well, it's not that important. In psychology, which is not exactly my field, but familiar enough with something called cognitive dissonance theory in psychology, which tells us that if we have two thoughts in our minds, for example, I should be doing this, I'm not doing this, that's a dissonant situation which can lead either to getting off your whatever and doing what you should be doing, or on the other hand saying, well, it's not that important anyway, to justify one's inaction. And I think a lot of what's happening with the press now is justifying the incredible inaction of our press from day one of the cover-up to whatever this day is. Where are the investigative reporters who have taken this, the problems in this case, and have made investigative work out of their study? Where are the Bernstein and Woodwards of the Washington Post that did the Watergate kind of investigative work? The press is out to lunch.
Think they've been bought?
Have they been bought? Probably to an extent. Certainly at the upper echelons of the media, they're quite likely, well, you're editing this. There are people in the Time Life media empire, for example, William Luce, Henry Luce, C.D. Jackson, and people there who are they are legitimate suspects of involvement in the assassination conspiracy. The sponsorship by Time Life of some of the actions in the summer of '63, some of the anti-Castro actions, and the kind of spin-off of that into the assassination. Those kinds of connections suggest a very real reason for people within the media, powerful people within the media, to have encouraged, bought, fired, whatever levers of power there are to keep the lid on the case and directions of conspiracy that might lead back to media people themselves. There's certainly that possible element.
What do you think?
But that gets into the nature of the conspiracy.
What is the big question, do you think, that should be asking? Bullets and trajectories aside,
who killed President Kennedy and why?
Why?
Why? Simple. I think the question is, who killed President Kennedy and why? Those are still the focused questions. This was put in perspective for me about this time last year or so. One of the things I do in my other life is I like to play Santa Claus at Christmas time. And last Christmas I was invited to come over to a house to play Santa, a house with a lot of children, and I went and I was doing the usual Santa Claus thing, and I didn't know the names of all these children, so the parents were, and I'm giving them their gifts from Santa that their parents had arranged. So I don't know all the kids' names, but the parents are kind of whispering, this is John, this is Mary, So I got to this little girl named Susan, and I said, Susan, here's your present from Santa Claus. She looks at me and she says, how'd you know my name? I said, caught short, what do you say? I said, well, Santa Claus knows everything. And quick as anything, she came back and said, who killed that president? I said, do you mean President Kennedy? Yeah, who killed President Kennedy? Now, I didn't say Susan was 6 years old. The one thing that she wanted to know from somebody that knew everything was who killed President Kennedy. And I think, out of the mouths of babes, if a 6-year-old in 1997 it was, is that concerned to know who killed that president, and I mean, where does that leave the rest of us in terms of our responsibilities, not just to ourselves but to the next generation? There's got to be more than one Susan in the world that has that question that is going to, until it's answered definitively and honestly, it's going to be who killed that president.
I'm married. He begins it and spends most of the book talking about the psychohistory of Oswald.
Yeah.
How is that? Is that important?
No. Well, important to what? I mean, it's not important to knowing who killed Kennedy.
Right. As in that,
Uh,
it doesn't, what does that prove?
it proves that Oswald was a psychopathic nut, which is the story from the start. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover determined within 2 days. Now, I don't want to say 2 days. He decided that night of the assassination that this was the work of a psychopathic nut. And it's just proven all over again. Norman Mailer's book, Gerald Posner's book, all these psychohistories, Portrait of the Assassin. You know, you want to talk about diversions. Zapruder film may be a diversion, but this kind of material is definitely diversionary. And also being talked about being paid, there's no question in my mind that Gerald Posner is an agent, if you will, of people that wanted that kind of story to be perpetuated. I mean, people have commented on, he gets to talk to Yuri Nisenko, and nobody's talked to Yuri Nisenko, the Soviet guy that says KGB had nothing to do with it. Nobody's talked to Yuri Nisenko because the CIA's had him under protected identity. But there's Gerald Posner interviewing Yuri Nisenko. He had very good resources.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. I like how Harry Livingston says it. You could talk all you want about Oswald. You can say dredge up anything you want, but if you can't put him in the window, firing those shots, you could take anybody. You could probably take me. Into my psychohistory.
Yeah, and a Russian wife. Whoa.
Oh yeah, must have a meaning there.
Yeah.
You know, somebody. Their parents were divorced, so you know that must have made them. Is there anything else that?